As we move into the 1960s, of course, what comes front and center at this time is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. is a central figure in the Civil Rights Movement, but he is not the central figure in the Civil Rights Movement. There are actually several major characters that play out in this whole era. And it is important to understand, as I will say often throughout my notes, it is important to understand that while Martin Luther King was a prime mover and shaker, there were others who also shared the load and helped bring civil rights to fruition. To understand civil rights, we should recap the long, shameful legacy of Jim Crow in the United States. Then we should look at the shock troops of the civil rights movement, that is, those who were the vanguard. And then we'll look at jails, fire hoses, and German shepherds. Then Freedom Summer, and then the legal end of segregation. Let's understand segregation in the United States, which we have often called in the South the Jim Crow laws. There you see the what's called the original Jim Crow. We'll get to that in a little bit, and the etymology of that term. Segregation in the United States consists in two forms. Number one, there is called de jure, or de jure segregation, and the de facto segregation. De jure segregation are the Jim Crow laws. That's segregation by law, where you have legal codes that actually separate the races. De facto segregation means that you don't particularly have a law in place, but you have patterns of housing segregation, bank lending practices, job discrimination, and discriminatory labor union practices. This is where real estate agents would help form restrictive covenantal communities. Banks would not lend for houses in particular areas and so forth. And so you would have a segregation in reality. Okay? In the South, you had mostly de jure segregation. In the North, it was de facto segregation. Okay, so the history of Jim Crow. Remember that in 1877, Union troops left the South and ended the period known as political Reconstruction. With Union troops no longer in the South to guard the polling places and the county courthouses and so forth, Southern redeemers, as they would call these, are Democrats that would slowly and then violently win back the state legislatures and so forth, regain control of the government, especially the state legislatures, county governments, and so forth. And then they begin to enact a series of measures to disenfranchise black people. Most notably poll taxes, which meant that you had to pay like $1 tax to vote. And this often disenfranchised poor whites as well, because people made a decision. Do I feed my family for a month on $1, or do I go and vote? Well, the choice was not a hard one to make. Literacy tests and all sorts of character tests and so forth. And then when that didn't work, well, you just intimidated people. I certainly hope that nothing happens to your house while you're away, since we're right now talking about the difference between hoping and ordering and so forth. And so the Northern troops leave the South, they leave Reconstruction to wither on the vine, and the North goes home and starts becoming the industrial giant that it is today, or that it would become, and is now a shadow of today, I should say. And the South declines into backwater status and is left alone. No federal funds, no help, no aid. They get their white privilege and liberty, they get their Jim Crow, and they don't get basically anything else. Jim Crow comes into being with the decision of the United States Supreme Court in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. And this, of course, has to do with the New Orleans to Covington Railroad Station, in which Homer Plessy purposefully sits in the whites-only section of the car, declares himself a colored person, and then refuses to move to the colored section when told to do so, and he is arrested. This was all a big test case, by the way. Everything was all set up ahead of time, but I don't want to go too much into the nuts and bolts of the operation. The decision of the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson affirms the notion of separate but equal. That is, as long as you can have equal accommodations, you can have separate accommodations. And this allows state government to codify segregation. And so we have Jim Crow laws, which are variations on the old black codes that existed prior to the Civil War. Well, even though it said separate but equal, again, using political legerdemain and so forth, African American facilities became less than equal. They would base it on tax or on literacy or on so forth, and so a white water fountain would be a really nice, sparkling, beautiful, new, cool water fountain, whereas a black water fountain was essentially a pipe coming out of the wall with a little basin for the water to come out. The term Jim Crow comes from a song and dance caricature of blacks performed by white actors in blackface, which are called minstrel shows. And it's called Jump Jim Crow. And that's where the term comes from. With the Jim Crow laws in effect, there was no civil rights legislation between 1883 and 1957. Now you do the math on that, and that's 74, 75 years. Numerous challenges to Jim Crow laws in the court systems were defeated. And so, for this 75-year period, African Americans were reduced to horrible indignities. I mean, everything was segregated. Movie houses, washaterias were segregated. Even whorehouses and jails were segregated. Everything became segregated, and then it was embraced by whites as a cherished institution. So who are the shock troops of the civil rights movement? Who are those that said, enough is enough, we deserve better? Very simple. Black veterans. Black veterans who had been emboldened and entitled by their war experiences. The veterans who came home to the South and began to assert their rights. This started with the First World War, especially African American troops who were sort of pawned off to the French as reserves for the French, because the Americans had this notion that when they went to the First World War, they would fight under their own flag and not simply as replacements. However, black soldiers, well, yes, they would be allowed to fight for the French. And they were treated by the French with more dignity and equality. We're not talking about total, complete egalitarianism, but they were treated much better by the French than they were by the Americans. And so, black soldiers who were coming home from the war, having won medals, having put their lives on the line in groups like the Harlem Hellfighters and so forth, believed themselves to be entitled to better rights. They had earned this right. And so you had black soldiers who had been disobeying the policy of bus segregation and refused to give up their seats long before Rosa Parks. Charles Hamilton Williams is the architect of the NAACP legal strategy of defying the civil rights laws and challenging them in court. World War I veteran. This, of course, when black veterans came home in uniform to their southern towns, this, of course, made for a great deal of white backlash, I should say, excuse me. And in 1919, you had what was known as Red Summer, where 135 black men were lynched, including 10 veterans. World War II only furthered the push by African Americans for civil rights. Korea as well. Korea saw the publishing of Executive Order 9088, which integrated the military. World War II veteran Hosea Williams, attached to Patton's Third Army. He leads the Selma March in 1955. Medgar Evers, the famous NAACP field officer in Mississippi, he was part of the Red Ball Express, which supplied the U.S. troops that were driving toward Germany after the D-Day landings. Medgar Evers leads a veterans march to demand voting rights. Of course, Medgar Evers would be shot in the back by Byron Della Beckworth, who himself was a World War II veteran. Floyd McKissick will organize the Greensboro sit-ins. Amzie Moore organizes Freedom Summer voting registrations, and both Greensboro and Freedom Summer we are going to start looking at very quickly. It's the 1950s that really see the blooming of the civil rights movement, and part of that has to do directly with the Cold War. The U.S. knew, leaders in the U.S. knew that any civil rights agitation that took place during the Cold War could potentially damage the United States' reputation as a bastion of freedom and democracy. African Americans knew this very well also, and they deemed it right for the time to strike, even though those like John F. Kennedy and others did say that African Americans who agitated during this time were unpatriotic and were doing it the wrong way and needed to have patience and time, to which those like Martin Luther King said, "Oh, we keep hearing about time. Time always means no." Okay, so in 1954, the Plessy v. Ferguson case is overturned with the desegregation of public schools, led by attorneys for Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas. The Brown v. Board of Education desegregated public schools with all deliberate speed. I don't want to get into all that, but it led to a great deal of interpretation where whites focused on deliberate and blacks focused on speed. There was an intense white resentment of the Brown v. Board of Education, especially among those whites that worked among blacks, and that meant bus drivers. Well, the Morgan v. Virginia case of 1946 desegregated interstate bus lines. However, many states simply refused to comply with the law. In 1953, you had a Baton Rouge, Louisiana bus boycott. Now, Claudette Colvin was the 15-year-old high school student who was arrested for failure to yield her seat. And so the NAACP wanted to make her the test case, but it was discovered that Claudette Colvin was pregnant before marriage. And so they did not want to have somebody like that who might give whites reason to sully the case. Then you had the Keys versus the Carolina Coach Company. It made private company segregation illegal. The big moment comes when Rosa Parks, who was secretary for the NAACP in the Montgomery area, on December the 5th, 1955, she sat in a section that was not deemed for whites or for blacks, but according to the rules, when whites needed to have a seat, then blacks needed to give up the sort of neutral area seating, and she refused to do so. Blacks had been complaining for a long time about white drivers who were driving right past them, not giving them proper change on the bus, essentially being treated awfully. And Montgomery was a place where it was deemed right for this, and so the bus boycott was called. And for 381 days, under the auspices of the Montgomery Improvement Association, African Americans either carpooled, oftentimes being threatened with arrest for having too many people in a car, or walked. For 381 days, this went on, and then finally it came to an end with a settlement. Now, this did not end segregation. It desegregated the buses, it mandated the hiring of black drivers in black neighborhood routes, which was very important, but bus segregation went on longer than this. But nonetheless, it is a watershed moment. When I talk about the Greensboro sit-ins, this began on February the 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 men called the Greensboro Four: Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, Isaiah Blair Jr., and David Richmond, decided that they were going to integrate the lunch counter at the Woolworth drugstore chain. Today we don't really understand what drugstore fountains are all about. They're a thing of the past. They're gone. They're a relic. Ain't there no more, as we like to say. But every drugstore had a lunch counter, and they were for whites only. Blacks could only order food to go from the side. These four men decided that they were going to sit down, order a cup of coffee, and of course they would not be served, but they would sit there all day long until it closed. And so this began to attract attention. Of course, whites came and heckled and pestered and poured ketchup and drinks over their heads, and they just sat there doing nothing. This then turns to Nashville in February the 13th. This time it's the Walgreens drugstore chain. Both of these incidents lead to the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so the shock troops of the Civil Rights Movement also began in many ways, the student protests of the 1960s. And of course, the joke eventually about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was it was neither nonviolent nor coordinated. Nonetheless, it is a major organization that will take part in the protests of the mid and late 1960s. The Selma to Montgomery marches, which we have been commemorating of late, was about voting rights, as African Americans would march from Selma, Alabama, to Montgomery, to the State House, in order to demand that voting rights be given. There was 3 marches, the first of which were broken up with violence by police and civilians against the marchers. But eventually, the Selma marches over the Edmund Pettus Bridge would reach the Capitol and begin the process of voting rights in Alabama. Then they turned their attention to Birmingham, which was literally a police state in the South. It was the most segregated city in 1963, and one of the reasons why you had Birmingham as such a militarized state almost was their police commissioner, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, who was essentially a psychopath. There was no doubt about it. And he was an unkind, dreadful human being to just about everyone whom he believed to be subordinate, especially African Americans. Students were used because employers were trying to pressure their black employees by making them work longer hours and threatening them with firing if they took part in the Birmingham movement. Well, instead they said, okay, well, we'll use students. We'll use high school kids and college kids. Well, student marches were attacked with fire hoses, which you see a fire hose hitting a black person there, and that's not just a nice little sprinkle. I mean, a fire hose has a tremendous power and can hurt and can pull skin off of bodies. German shepherds were unleashed, and then when that all was done, then they were thrown in jail. And what do you think the Soviet propaganda apparatus made of all that? Well, because of all this, businesses came to a standstill. It's business in the end that says we can't afford this black eye on us. We are being killed business-wise. People are not coming to Birmingham either because they don't feel safe or because they don't want to have anything to do with it. And eventually the Jim Crow signs came down. Bull Connor was unrepentant till his dying day, although he spent the later part of his years in a stroke-induced half coma. He never once repented of his actions. And much of the Birmingham movement was organized around the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so the Ku Klux Klan bombed it, and in the process 4 young girls were killed. And when those 4 young girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church, this really mobilizes the nation to see exactly just how brutal things were down in the South and how awful Jim Crow really was down there. The next stage of the eyes on the prize, as civil rights leaders often called it, was Freedom Riders and Freedom Summers. Now you see Congressman John L. Lewis of the 5th Congressional District in Georgia. He is one of the Freedom Riders who was physically assaulted along the way. The rides were to challenge the non-compliance of bus companies and states with the Morgan ruling, that the interstate bus traffic should not be segregated because of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And so these Freedom Riders, white and black, would board on Greyhound buses in Washington, D.C., and ride from Washington to New Orleans starting on May the 4th, 1961. They got to Atlanta and then began their trek toward Alabama. And once they crossed the state line, there were the Klan and the police and the good old boys waiting for them. They bombed the buses. They beat up John Lewis and others. It was even worse in Birmingham. Bull Connor, of course, was sitting there licking his chops, waiting for them to come in. When the Freedom Riders were able to get on the bus and head for Mississippi, there, Governor Ross Barnett decided that there was not going to be any mob violence there because he didn't want his state of Mississippi, which was even worse than Alabama in many respects, to come out looking bad. And so he arranged to have the Freedom Riders very quietly put into jail, where they were put into jail for a long time until Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy could have them released, until they finally made their way down to New Orleans. The Freedom Riders were criticized by the Kennedys, though. They were now calling the Freedom Riders unpatriotic. The Kennedys, of course, were very highly conscious of their country's standing in light of the Cold War, and they felt that the Freedom Riders were bringing an undue amount of negative attention on the United States at a time when they needed to seem strong in the fight against communism. And of course the communists in Russia were saying, see, look, what do you know? These people cannot even maintain rights in their own country. Freedom Summer took place in 1964 with voting registration drives carried throughout the South by a number of people. This was largely a northern driven phenomenon with much of the help of the South, where young, eager volunteers from the North came south to take part in Freedom Summer. What were the programs? Establishing desegregated schools, establishing desegregated safe houses, and also establishing desegregated libraries, because as you may have watched if you saw the movie Hidden Figures, there are libraries were segregated, and believe me, black libraries were not nearly as good as white libraries. There's a great deal of violence against Freedom Summer. This is perhaps the most violent turn of the civil rights movement. 1,062 people arrested, 80 Freedom Summer workers beaten, 37 churches bombed or burned, 30 black homes and businesses bombed or burned. 4 civil rights workers were killed, one in a head-on collision. 4 people critically wounded, and at least 3 Mississippi African Americans murdered because of their support for the civil rights movement. 3 of those 4 civil rights workers were Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney. Now, Goodman and Schwerner were Northerners from New York who came down south to help in the voting registration of Freedom Summer. James Chaney was a local who coordinated with Schwerner and Chaney. On June the 21st, 1964, in Neshoba County, Mississippi, where Meridian is located, these 3 men were arrested for their activities, thrown in jail. Then they were released. When they left the jail, they went out into the country, where the Philadelphia, Mississippi police arrested them, and in collusion with the Klan and the Neshoba County police, murdered them. And they buried the 3 bodies in an earthen dam. This brings down the FBI, state authorities, and even personnel from the U.S. Navy to go and search the swamps. With the help of an informer, they found the bodies of the 3. And the FBI, after its investigation, determined that the Ku Klux Klan worked in conjunction with local police and had murdered the 3 men. In the end, they were not able to secure any state charges against the perpetrators, because state charges meant local juries, and local juries meant either acquittal or suspended sentences. In the end, they got most of the perpetrators on civil rights violations, but none of them served more than 6 years in prison. It was not until the 2000s that the chief organizer of the murders was sentenced to 3 consecutive 20-year sentences. So he's serving 60 years in prison. He'll never get out again. The aftermath of Freedom Summer was this. Many of the white students, those like Schwerner and Goodman, having done their duty, having scratched their itch, having come down to the South to do good, now turned their attention to the problems of the North. And this left many in the South a little bit bitter. They felt that these Northerners had come down to make themselves feel good at the expense of African Americans. And this, of course, leads to sort of a kind of a harsh relationship later on between African Americans and Jews, who at the time, this was the pinnacle of their relations. But these students who had come down south and participated in Freedom Summer, they are the vanguard of the protest movements of the later 1960s. They are members later on of Black Panthers, of the Students for a Democratic Society. They joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a variety of other radical student organizations. The legal end of segregation, not civil rights, were the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law July the 2nd, 1964, despite a 23-and-a-half-hour filibuster by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. It remains on record as the longest filibuster in Senate history. And what a thing to take pride in nowadays. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and had a series of prohibitions on all sorts of segregation and restrictions. It uses as its basis the Commerce Clause and the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law, prohibited barriers to voting based on race or literacy. It set down general guidelines for elections, how elections should be conducted, noticing how the federal government is exerting its force over the states. And it also set down enforcement guidelines. That is, in certain areas where it was known for a high restrictive voting, federal observers would be sent down there to guarantee that a fair vote would take place. The picture you see there in the upper corner is Malcolm X and Martin Luther King meeting on March the 26th, 1964, as Congress is deliberating the Civil Rights Act. They met for 1 minute where they spoke together. It was a cordial meeting. It was the only meeting these two civil rights giants had with each other, as Malcolm X would be murdered the next year. And that picture there shows President Lyndon Johnson signing into law the Civil Rights Act. And if you notice, there is Dr. Martin Luther King and a very young John Lewis standing to the left behind, one of the white senators. Lyndon Johnson, for all his complexities, and believe me, he was a very complex man, and he had a lot of darkness to his personality, had a streak of moral courage in him that was a mile wide. For he knew, as a Southern Democrat, that he was going to lose the support of most of the Democrats from the South in his own party. And yet he went ahead and did it anyhow. And that tells you that there is a certain goodness to the man that went along with the darkness in the man.